Welcome back to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're looking at something, well, pretty fundamental to human experience. We're diving into the philosophy of sex and sexuality. And, you might think for something so universal and so impactful, philosophers would have been all over it from, the very beginning. But surprisingly, that's not quite how it went down, at least not in Western thought.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Historically, when philosophers did address sex, it was often kind of a side note and often with a pretty negative spin. I mean, think about Plato, right? He saw the physical world as like a distraction, a step down from pure intellectual pursuits. So sex, well, not really his top priority.
Not exactly a recipe for a steamy philosophy, huh?
Not quite. And Aristotle, well, he didn't really say much about it at all. Then you have the big names in Christian thought, Augustine and Aquinas, and for them, sex was basically only okay for making babies. And even later on, really influential thinkers like Kant, they really struggled to fit sexual desire into their moral systems. And Sartre, well, he saw sex as this power struggle, one person trying to trap the other's freedom through their body.
So for centuries, it was basically avoidance or negativity when it came to the philosophy of sex.
Pretty much. But things have really shifted in recent decades. There's been this huge surge of interest from philosophers really trying to grapple with the complexities of sex and sexuality in all their forms.
And this is where our deep dive comes in. We're going to be drawing from a super in-depth entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's a really comprehensive overview of all the key ideas and debates. It's like our map for this philosophical journey.
Exactly. And it's not just about revisiting the old debates. Contemporary philosophers are asking really fundamental questions like what is sexual desire at its core? How do we even define sexual activity given all the variations and nuances? And what about sexual pleasure? How do we understand that from a philosophical perspective?
And beyond those basics, we're also going to be getting into how philosophers view sexual orientation, those deep-seated preferences. How do those preferences relate to our sexual identities? And maybe most importantly, we'll be tackling all the big moral questions surrounding the ethics of it all.
Exactly. Things like consent, of course, which is so crucial, but also the whole issue of objectification, which is really thorny, and even what makes sex good or bad, not just ethically, but in other ways too.
So a lot to unpack. Let's dive right in. And why don't we start with the basic element sexual desire. It's this powerful force, right? It's tied to attraction, pleasure, motivation, even just feeling aroused.
Yeah.
But what is it exactly?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Are we talking about a basic biological urge, kind of like being hungry, or is it more complex than that? Is it really shaped by our minds, our intentions, the meanings we attach to it?
I mean, there's definitely a biological component, right? Hormones and all that. But then there's the whole layer of who we're attracted to, the specific scenarios we find arousing that feels very mental, very personal.
Right. It's not just a generic urge for any physical contact. So philosophers have come up with different ways to think about it. One influential view is what's called the pleasure view. And philosophers like Goldman and Primoratz are big proponents of this. Basically, they see sexual desire as a desire for bodily contact with another person and the pleasure that comes with it. Or sometimes it's framed even more broadly, like just a desire for sexual pleasure, period.
So in that broader view, things like masturbation, voyeurism, even exhibitionism, those could all fit under that umbrella of sexual desire because they're about the pursuit of sexual pleasure.
Exactly. But then you have other philosophers like Morgan who argue for what's called the intentional view. They say that sexual desire is always about something. It's always directed at someone or something specific under a certain description. Even if you desire anonymous sex, what you're really desiring is anonymous sex. It's not just a random urge. There's an object to that desire, and there's a reason behind it, even if that reason is just, I want to experience this particular kind of pleasure.
So it's not just a biological program firing off. There's a thought process and intentionality behind it.
Exactly. And often that intentionality involves another person. Scruton talks about sexual desire as, and I'm paraphrasing here, taking our basic animal urges and directing them toward another person. And some even go further and say that sexual desire should be tied to love, that it finds its truest fulfillment in a loving relationship.
But is it fair to say that all sexual desire has to be directed at another person? What about desires that are intentionally solitary?
That's a really good point. And even within the intentional view, not everyone agrees on that. And even with the pleasure view, which focuses on the physical sensations, it doesn't have to be just this mindless urge. Goldman himself talks about how even masturbation can be very intentional, very specific. You have a certain fantasy in mind. You choose a certain kind of stimulation. It's not just random.
So maybe these two views, pleasure and intentionality, aren't totally separate.
Hmm.
Maybe sexual desire can be both intensely physical and very intentional at the same time.
Exactly. But let's put on our critical thinking caps for a second and look at some of the challenges to the pleasure view. Like Jacobson, another philosopher, raises some interesting points. He asks, how do we even define sexual pleasure? Can we do it without just circling back to desire itself? And what about cases where sex isn't primarily about pleasure, like when a couple is trying to conceive? And he also argues that if pleasure was all we cared about, then it wouldn't matter who our partner was, as long as they could provide that pleasure. And that doesn't really reflect our actual experiences of desire.
Yeah, that interchangeability thing is interesting. If it were truly just about the physical sensation, then logically it shouldn't matter who's providing it. But we know that's not how it works in real life.
Right. So Jacobson proposes his own feature-based approach. He says that sexual desire is all about sexual arousal, that feeling of being turned on, plus the desire for the specific things that we think will cause that arousal. So it's not about the pleasure itself, but about the anticipation of it based on certain features or actions.
But how do we define sexual arousal then? If it's just the feeling we get when we're sexually aroused, haven't we just gone in a circle?
Yeah, there's a bit of a circularity problem there. And even if you focus on the physiological responses like increased heart rate, lubrication, erection, that doesn't necessarily capture the whole subjective experience of feeling aroused. So there's still work to be done there.
What about that example of sex for procreation without a focus on pleasure? Does that automatically rule out the pleasure view?
Not necessarily. I mean, we have to be careful about distinguishing between what we might call sexual motives and other kinds of motives. A sexual motive is wanting to do something because it will bring sexual pleasure. But you can have other motives too, like wanting to have a child. So even in sex for procreation, there might still be a desire for pleasure present, even if it's not the main driving force.
Right. It's like you can want to do something for multiple reasons. You can enjoy the process, even if the main goal is something else.
Exactly. And this leads us to another big question about sexual desire. Is it inherently a good thing, or is it something to be wary of? You have these two camps, the optimists and the pessimists, and they have very different takes on this.
Yeah, historically, there's been a lot of pessimism about sexual desire. It's seen as dangerous, something that can cloud your judgment and lead you astray.
Right. Thinkers like Augustine, Kant, and even more contemporary philosophers like Sobel, they express this deep skepticism about sexual desire. Sartre, as we mentioned earlier, saw it as a way of trying to possess another person, to deny their freedom. And Kant was really concerned that it reduces people to their bodies, to their flesh, as he put it, and that it makes it really hard to treat them as fully human, as ends in themselves, rather than just means to your own pleasure.
So the worry is that when you're caught up in sexual desire, you're not seeing the other person as a whole person, but more like a body to be used for your own gratification.
Exactly. Although, to be fair to Kant, he wasn't saying that people who experience sexual desire literally want a corpse or an unconscious person. It's more about this potential to, like, lose sight of the other person's humanity in the heat of the moment.
And on the flip side, you have the optimists who see sexual desire as, well, not inherently bad at all. It can be a source of connection, intimacy, pleasure. It can bring people together.
Right. Thinkers like Russell, Singer, and Nussbaum, they point to the potential for sensitivity, for genuine appreciation of another person's mind and character alongside their physicality. And they often see sexual pleasure itself as something good, something valuable in its own right.
So the big philosophical disagreement here is whether sexual desire is inherently problematic or if it's more about how we choose to act on it and the context surrounding those actions.
Exactly. Now let's move on to another concept where philosophers have really gotten into the weeds, and that's the definition of sexual activity itself. It seems so obvious in everyday life, but try to pin down a precise definition and things get really tricky.
I know, right? We all think we know what having sex means,
Yeah.
but when you try to define it philosophically, it's like, wait, what does count as sexual activity?
Exactly. And even the language gets confusing. Like, we say having sex, but also sexual activity. We might consider things like masturbation or oral sex as sexual activities, but not necessarily the same as having sex. So Posel even argued recently that masturbation should be seen as on a continuum of sexual activities, not a totally separate category.
So if we're trying to get philosophical about it, What are some of the criteria people have proposed to define sexual activity?
Well, one idea is to focus on reproduction. Like, a sexual act is one that is meant to or could potentially lead to making a baby.
But that immediately rules out, like, any same-sex activity and even heterosexual sex where the goal isn't procreation. So that seems way too narrow.
Way too narrow. So what about bodily contact? Like, a sexual act has to involve contact with certain body parts. But even that gets messy. Think about a doctor examining a patient, right? They might touch genitals, but we wouldn't call that sexual activity. And on the other hand, someone can have an orgasm from phone sex without any physical contact at all.
So physical contact isn't always necessary, and the lack of it doesn't mean something isn't sexual. What about pleasure? Could we say a sexual act is one that aims at producing sexual pleasure?
That's another option, but it has its own problems. People can have sex without experiencing pleasure, right?
Hmm.
And just because you get a brief flash of sexual pleasure, like seeing someone attractive on the street, that doesn't mean you're engaging in a sexual activity.
What about intention then? Like the intention has to be to produce sexual pleasure.
That's been proposed, but it still doesn't quite work. Like, if a couple has sex specifically to conceive, their intention might be more about having a baby than about the pleasure itself. And you can imagine scenarios where someone is trying to arouse someone else in ways we wouldn't consider a sexual act, like just through words.
Okay, so intention alone isn't enough. What about desire? Like Goldman, he tried to define a sexual act as one that tends to fulfill sexual desire.
Right. And that sounds promising, but think about it. A sex worker performing a sexual act for a client. It might satisfy the client's desire, but not necessarily the worker's own desire. So fulfilling desire doesn't seem like a requirement. And then there's the question of what satisfaction even means. If it just means the desire goes away temporarily, then even taking a cold shower could count as satisfying a desire, and that doesn't seem right.
So it's like we have all these different elements, the behavior, the intention, the body parts involved, the presence of pleasure or desire, and none of them alone seem to be enough to definitively say what counts as sexual activity.
Exactly. And that's why some philosophers have proposed these like disjunctive definitions. Basically, they say an activity is sexual if it meets any of several criteria. Like, it could be about the motive, the desire, the body parts involved, or just like fitting our common sense understanding of what a sexual act is.
So it's like there's no single defining feature, but rather a cluster of them. And if enough of them are present, then we can call it a sexual activity.
Right. But even that approach gets complicated. You have to make sure each criterion is valid on its own, and that the whole definition isn't so broad that it becomes meaningless. And then there's the underlying question of whether we're even talking about one concept here, maybe having sex, sexual activity, sexual encounter. Maybe these are all related but slightly different things.
So defining sexual activity a lot more philosophically complex than it first appears.
Definitely. Now let's talk about another crucial element of sex. Sexual pleasure. If we're thinking like philosophers, how do we even understand pleasure in this context?
Right, because it's not just one simple thing, is it? There's the physical sensation, but also the emotional aspect, the enjoyment, and even just like the satisfaction of having had a pleasurable experience.
Exactly. Philosophers have identified different types of pleasure, and they all come into play when we're talking about sex. Goldman, for instance, he talks about four main types. There's pleasure as sensation, which is the most basic, the direct physical feeling, like the touch of skin or the sensations of orgasm. Then there's pleasure as enjoyment, which is more about actively engaging with something and enjoying the process, not just the physical sensations, like the overall enjoyment of a sexual encounter.
So the first one is more passive,
Yeah,
just receiving the sensation. The second one is more active. You're participating in the pleasure and appreciating it as it unfolds.
exactly. And then there's pleasure as feeling, which is more about a general mood or emotional state, like the feeling of well-being or happiness you might have after good sex. And finally, there's pleasure as pro-attitude, which is basically being pleased that something happened, like being glad that you had that sexual encounter, even after it's over.
So it's not just about the moment itself. It's also about how you feel afterwards, looking back on it.
Right. And what's interesting is that these different types of pleasure don't always go together. You could have intense physical sensations during sex, but not really enjoy the experience on an emotional level. Or you could enjoy the interaction itself, but later feel bad about it for some reason.
What about orgasm, then? That's often seen as the peak of sexual pleasure. Is there anything philosophically unique about it?
Yeah, it's interesting. The pleasure of orgasm is often described as unique in its intensity, the specific way it feels, and physiologically it's also different, especially because of its connection to genital stimulation. But philosophically, what's interesting is how its social and cultural meaning can vary so much.
So the basic physical sensation might be pretty similar across people, but what that sensation means can be very different depending on the culture or the context.
Exactly. And this leads to a kind of puzzle. If the physical sensations of orgasm are often stronger during masturbation, why do people generally prefer sex with a partner? It suggests that it's not just about that peak sensation. There's something about the interaction, the intimacy that adds to the pleasure, like the pleasure of touching, kissing, just being close to another person.
Maybe it's about experiencing that intense pleasure within the context of those other interactions, which might be less intense, but still very meaningful.
That's a good way to put it. Now, going back to defining sexual desire, some philosophers, like Primaretz, focus on pleasure as sensation as the key element. They basically say that what makes something a sexual pleasure is its connection to those sensations in the erogenous zones. So all the other types of pleasure, enjoyment, good feeling, satisfaction, those are only sexual if they're based on those physical sensations.
So the physical sensations are the foundation, and everything else is built on top of that.
Right. And this connects back to some older philosophical ideas, like Aristotle talked about temperance, about controlling your bodily appetites, especially the ones related to touch. And sexual pleasure, especially the intense kind that leads to orgasm, that's a powerful motivator for people to engage in sex. And it's a key part of how we even define sexual desire.
But as we talked about earlier, people have sex for all sorts of reasons,
Hmm.
not just pleasure. So how does that fit in?
Yeah, that's an important point. People have sex for love, connection, intimacy, all kinds of things. But even in those cases, pleasure is often still a factor, even if it's not the main goal. Like when we talk about sexual desire, even if it's mixed up with other desires, there's usually this underlying implication that there's potential for sexual pleasure involved.
Okay, so we tackled desire, activity, pleasure. Now, what about sexual preferences and orientation? How do philosophers understand those concepts?
Well, sexual orientation is generally seen as this pretty stable, deep-seated preference for being attracted to men, women, or both. It's kind of like a core part of who you are, unlike a preference for like a certain hair color. And it tends to shape your more specific sexual preferences. Like you might identify as lesbian, which is your orientation, and then also have a preference for partners who are really funny, which is just a preference.
So orientation is the big picture, and preferences are the details within that picture.
Exactly. But some philosophers question how clear-cut that distinction really is, like what makes an orientation basic as opposed to just a really strong preference. Helwani, he argued that a key difference might be that fulfilling your sexual orientation is really important for your overall well-being in a way that fulfilling a mere preference isn't.
So it's not just about how strong the preference is, but also about how central it is to your sense of self and your happiness.
Right. Now, beyond orientation, you have all sorts of other sexual preferences for specific acts, body types, personalities, all kinds of things. And some of those preferences are considered morally problematic, like pedophilia. Others raise more complex ethical questions, like, say, a preference for partners of a certain race. Is that just personal taste, or could it be tied to harmful stereotypes or prejudices?
So even something as seemingly personal as a preference isn't always morally neutral. It can have ethical implications.
Exactly. And even the way we usually talk about sexual orientation, gay, straight, bi, that's been challenged philosophically. Like, what about people who are attracted to people outside the gender binary? Or people whose attractions are more about specific body parts, regardless of gender? And the traditional model often mixes up sex and gender, and it can be unclear whether we're talking about sexual attraction or emotional attraction. Like, the American Psychological Association defines sexual orientation as an enduring pattern of emotional, romantic, and/or sexual attractions.
So those basic categories might not capture the full spectrum of human experience when it comes to attraction.
Right. And then there's the question of what even makes something an orientation? Is it about behavior, desire, fantasy? And how do we account for changes over time or differences between what someone does desire and what they might desire under different circumstances?
And then there's that whole debate about the history of sexual orientations,
Yeah.
the essentialism versus social constructionism thing.
Yeah, that's a big one. Essentialists believe that categories like gay and straight have always existed across time and cultures. Social constructionists argue that those categories are specific to certain times and places, and that they might not apply to other cultures or historical periods. Like, someone might say that people in ancient Greece had same sex relationships, but they wouldn't have thought of themselves as gay in the same way we do today.
So it's a question of whether these are fundamental categories of human existence, or if they're more like social constructs that change over time.
Exactly, and both sides have their challenges. Like, essentialists have to explain why the expression of same-sex attraction has varied so much throughout history. And strong social constructionists have to account for the fact that some patterns of attraction seem to show up across cultures, and there might even be biological factors involved.
Okay, so lots to think about there. Now, what about asexuality? How does that fit into the philosophical picture?
So, asexuality is generally defined as a lack of sexual attraction to others. It's important to distinguish it from celibacy, which is a choice to abstain from sex, and also from having a low sex drive. Asexual people might still experience other forms of attraction, like romantic attraction. They might even engage in sexual activities for reasons other than attraction to another person, like for pleasure or stress relief. But the key thing is that they don't feel sexually drawn to others.
So they might still enjoy sex, but it's not because they're attracted to the other person in a sexual way.
Exactly. And this leads to the debate about whether asexuality is a sexual orientation itself. Some people argue that it is because it's a distinct pattern of attraction or lack thereof. Others say it's more like the absence of an orientation. And this debate has implications for like social recognition and legal protections.
So the way we categorize it can have real-world consequences for asexual people.
Yeah.
Now, what about sexual identity more broadly? It seems like it's more than just who you're attracted to. It's about your sense of self, your connection to a community.
Definitely. And identity itself is a complex philosophical concept. It can be about how you describe yourself, the values you hold, the groups you belong to. And with sexual identity, there's the difference between how you see yourself and how others see you, and those might not always match up.
And there's also the element of choice, right? Like you can choose to identify as gay, even if you haven't always experienced same-sex attraction, maybe because you feel connected to the culture or the community.
Exactly. And conversely, someone might experience same-sex attraction but not want to identify as gay for personal or religious reasons or whatever. And one philosopher, Ansler, he proposed this cultural theory of queer sexual identity. He says it's about being excluded from mainstream straight culture and then finding a sense of belonging in queer culture. So it's not just about who you're attracted to, but also about your experiences and your social context.
So identity is multi-layered. It's about attraction, but also about culture, community, personal choices.
Right, and even if the exact definition of sexual orientation is still debated, the concept of sexual identity is really useful for understanding ourselves and others. And it can be the basis for social and legal protections for diverse groups.
Okay, so we spent a lot of time on the basic concepts. Now let's get into the more like ethical and moral stuff. The questions of right and wrong when it comes to sex.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting and often heated. Like even just the phrases good sex and bad sex, those can mean so many different things. We could be talking about the pleasure involved, the morality of the act, aesthetic qualities, practical consequences, legal issues, even whether something is considered natural or not.
Wait, aesthetic qualities? Like judging sex as if it were a work of art.
Yeah, it's a bit of a niche area of philosophy, but some people have explored it. Like, they talk about things like unity, coherence, completeness in a sexual encounter, even concepts like beauty and harmony. But the big question is, do those aesthetic concepts even make sense when we're talking about sex, which is often messy and unpredictable?
So it's like, could you really apply the same standards of judgment to a sexual experience as you would to a painting or piece of music?
Right. And then, of course, there's the practical side of things. Like, is it a good idea to sex with someone if you're a politician? Or to have unprotected sex? Those have practical consequences that can be good or bad. But the core ethical question is really about the morality of sex. Like, when is it okay to have sex? What makes a sexual act morally permissible? That's the big question, right? And one influential perspective comes from natural law theory. It's based on the ideas of Aristotle and Aquinas, and it takes a pretty conservative stance. Basically, it says that sex is only okay within a very specific context, usually marriage.
So the idea is that our bodies have a natural purpose, and that purpose is reproduction. And if you're having sex for any other reason, You're going against that natural purpose.
Right. And some natural law philosophers emphasize this idea of a perverted faculty. Like if you're not using your sexual organs for their intended purpose, you're perverting them. Others focus more on the unitive aspect of sex within marriage, the idea that the physical union of the couple is tied to the potential for procreation.
So consent alone isn't enough. The act also has to be open to the possibility of procreation, and it has to be motivated by the good of the marriage, which is seen as inherently procreative.
Exactly. But this view has faced a lot of criticism, both from within philosophy and from society at large. Like, people question whether this narrow view of marriage is even accurate or fair, and they challenge the idea that reproduction is the only morally acceptable purpose for sex. Like, what about pleasure, intimacy, expressing love? Those are all good things too, right?
Right, and some people have argued that even within natural law theory, you could make a case for same-sex relationships, focusing on the unitive aspect rather than the procreative aspect.
Exactly. So there are different interpretations even within that framework. But what about other approaches to sexual ethics? Ones that don't rely on natural law?
Yeah, what are some of the alternatives?
Well, some philosophers focus on love as the key factor. Like, Scruton argued that sex is only okay within the context of love. Others emphasize things like affection, mutual respect, the absence of exploitation. The common thread in these views is that sex can be risky, it can lead to harm, and those things love, respect, consent bright, those help to mitigate the risks.
So it's less about the act itself and more about the quality of the relationship and way people are treating each other.
Exactly. But even those views have been challenged. Like Sobel pointed out that love and respect don't necessarily prevent all forms of harm in a sexual encounter.
And going beyond just whether sex is permissible, can it also be morally good or bad, like other actions?
Definitely. Even if an act is morally okay, it can still be done in a way that's virtuous or vicious. Like you could have sex out of generosity or care for your partner, which would make it morally good. Or you could have sex selfishly or with malicious intent, which would be morally bad.
So consent is the baseline, but it doesn't mean all consensual sex is morally equal. What about obligations then? Do we have a moral obligation to have sex with anyone?
That's a tricky one. In established romantic or sexual relationships, there's often an expectation of sexual intimacy, and some philosophers would argue that there's an obligation to fulfill that expectation to a certain extent. But outside of those relationships, things get murky. Like, some people have argued that disabled people have a right to sex because it's essential for a good life.
Yeah.
But that raises all sorts of practical and ethical issues about who would be obligated to provide that sex and whether it's even possible to guarantee someone a fulfilling sexual experience.
Right, it's a very complex issue. And then there's the question of whether we have obligations to ourselves. Like, if you have a harmful sexual desire, do you have a moral obligation to try and change it?
That's a controversial one, partly because it's hard to say which desires are inherently bad and how much control we really have over them. And then there's the bigger question, is sex morally special? Does it have its own set of rules, or do the same moral principles apply to sex as to any other area of life?
Now, what's the answer to that?
Well, most philosophers would agree that general moral principles definitely apply to sex. But they also recognize that sex has some unique features that might require special consideration, like the fact that it involves our bodies in a very intimate way, and the potential for harm and objectification, and also the specific virtues and vices that can come up in a sexual context.
Okay, so let's talk about one of those special considerations.
Yeah.
Consent. It seems like everyone agrees that it's crucial, but what exactly does it mean when we're talking about sex?
Yeah, informed and voluntary consent is pretty much universally seen as a necessary condition for sex to be morally okay. It's what separates a consensual encounter from sexual assault. But there's still debate about whether consent alone is always enough to make sex morally right.
So why is consent so important? What makes it so morally significant?
It's about respecting people's autonomy, their right to make decisions about their own bodies. And it helps to prevent harm because being forced into sex is deeply damaging. And some philosophers have even suggested that there might be evolutionary reasons why we place such a high value on sexual consent. Like, it might have been beneficial for our ancestors to develop strong norms around consent to avoid conflict and ensure reproductive success.
So what does valid consent actually look like? It's more than just saying yes, right?
Definitely. It has to be clear and unambiguous. It can be verbal or nonverbal, but it has to communicate willingness to engage in a specific sexual act. And there's debate about whether you need an outward expression of consent or if it's enough for someone to consent internally, in their mind. And then there's a question of enthusiasm, like, Do you have to be enthusiastic to truly consent? Or is it okay to be hesitant or ambivalent?
And what about ongoing sexual interactions? Like, do you have to keep consenting at every stage, or is one initial consent enough?
That's a tricky area.
Hmm.
Generally, consent has to be ongoing, and you can withdraw it at any point. And there are all sorts of things that can invalidate consent, even if someone says yes, like if they're being coerced or threatened, or if they're too intoxicated to make a clear decision, or if someone is deceiving them about something important, like whether they have an STI.
So even if someone says yes, if there's pressure or manipulation involved, that consent might not be valid.
Right. And some philosophers argue that consent isn't always sufficient to make sex okay. Like, if you believe that sex is only morally permissible within a loving relationship, then consent from someone you don't love wouldn't be enough. And then there's the Kantian view, which says that even with consent, sex is still objectifying and therefore morally problematic.
So even if everyone's on board, the act itself could still be seen as morally wrong, according to that view.
Exactly. And then you have arguments about potential harm. Like, even if everyone consents, if the act is likely to cause harm to one or both parties, then maybe it's not okay. But that gets into tricky territory because it starts to sound like we're telling people what they can and can't do with their own bodies.
So lots of different perspectives on consent. What about the necessity of consent? Are there ever situations where it's not required?
Most philosophers would say that consent is pretty much always necessary. But there are some very specific exceptions that people have debated, like in cases where someone is incapable of giving consent and the sexual act is considered very minor. But those are really edge cases. The vast majority of the time, consent is absolutely essential.
Okay, let's move on to another big topic, objectification. We hear that word thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean in a philosophical context?
Basically, it means treating someone as a mere object, specifically a sex object. And this idea has its roots in Kant, who believed that we should always treat people as ends in themselves, not as means to our own ends. And feminist philosophers have really developed this concept, applying it to things like pornography and patriarchal power structures.
So it's about reducing someone to their sexual function or their attractiveness and ignoring their whole personhood.
Exactly. And there's debate about whether objectification requires a specific action or if it can just be a way of thinking about someone. Like, is staring at someone lustfully a form of objectification or thinking about them in a purely sexual way? And the reason objectification is considered bad is because it violates people's dignity. It treats them as less than human.
What are some specific ways that people get objectified?
Well, Nussbaum, a philosopher, she made this list of different aspects of objectification, like instrumentality, treating someone as a